Hey everyone, thank you guys for joining us in today's episode. I'm your host, Ivan.
I'm Jack.
I'm Jackie.
I'm Kylan.
Today we'll be talking about the very controversial topic, especially in today's world, about Big Pharma and their ethics of their business model. So, just a brief rundown of why Big Pharma is such a big controversial topic is because, especially with the pandemic and COVID-19 vaccines, these pharmaceutical companies are definitely playing an even larger role than they had in the past couple of decades. Simply because we're really reliant on their products, such as the COVID mRNA vaccines, but also things like insulin and more specific medicines for more specific diseases. So one of the biggest topic is definitely the profit margins for these big pharmaceutical companies. And according to some research, is that they're earning way more They have a way larger profit margin, pharmaceutical companies, than compared to S&P 500 companies. And it's not like a very little difference. It's like really big, big as in 39.1%. So what are you guys' thoughts about their kind of the business model of these big pharma companies?
I think the business model is like so I'm not like the most educated on big pharma, but I know like for example for insulin, it's like they make a lot of money off of it and like even though it doesn't take that much to actually produce it, they can still sell it for a lot. And I think a part of it is like because it's one of those things where like it's not a luxury item, right? Like I cannot eat a cookie, but I can't like if I'm sick, I can't not get insulin. And I think that's like what kind of allows them to sell certain products like at such a high price point. And I think like obviously that's not okay. And like there's a lot of ethical concerns of it. But at the same time, like if you're in the position of the business, you're not gonna limit yourself. But I think like for the people, I think maybe the government should step in and be like, hey, you can't sell this for like literally 100 times more than what it took you to make. Because we can't like really rely on the companies to regulate themselves like that. I think realistically that just won't make sense. But if governments were to step in and be like, hey, this is a little insane, you can't do that, that's like so unethical and like very unfair to the people who actually are in need of the medicine, right? And I also think there's like a thing of inequity there. Like if you're super rich and it's like $150 for insulin, like you'll be like, okay, that's like more than I should be paying for it, but like whatever, if it's gonna help me and my health, I'll pay for it. But if you're like poor and you can't really afford it and you don't have health insurance, then you're like, oh my God, I can't spend that much money. Like, would I rather eat food or would I rather have like money for that? And I think that's where a lot of the ethics come back up again.
Yeah, I definitely agree with those points. Definitely see that like a lot of like the medications that people take, and sometimes when the production costs are like really low, these medication they sell like they're very high, and I it could be unaffordable for like some, especially the impoverished who definitely need them to like save lives, but they can't get them because of like income inequity and also with the income inequality. um I feel like sometimes when like the big pharmaceutical companies produce like vaccines or other like medications, is often like the big pharmaceuticals they'll spread them to like the richer countries first, and then like they'll like branch out to the poorer countries. That's like it's like what happened with like the COVID vaccine. We saw a lot of doses being handed out to like America and other developed countries, while the underdeveloped countries didn't really see as much.
Yeah, like actually, the more I think about it, like the research costs, especially that brought into light by the development for the COVID-19 with the new mRNA technology, is that the research costs are definitely going to be very high. But is it really justifiable for those outrageous prices? Like the COVID-19 vaccine is, I don't think you pay for that because like it's literally a public health crisis, right? But like things, for example, insulin, those things, sure, the research was done by a guy in Canada and he sold the patent for like 1 cent. And like companies, what was it called? Eli Lilly, like that's a big company in insulin production. They're selling insulin for around like 250 times their production cost because of like economies of scale, right? The more you produce, the cheaper it becomes to produce. So definitely questionable ethics from many of these big pharma companies, but we're also so reliant on them.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think I saw this article that said like 1 in 4 people suffering from diabetes have to like ration their current insulin because they can't afford to buy new ones because regular insulin's like hundreds of dollars, right? So the fact that people have to do this is kind of like you're putting your own health at risk just because um like large pharmaceutical companies they want to make more money. I just think that's like people's health and well-being is like the most important thing.
Yeah, and like also especially with the rise of the pandemic, like the public trust of these big pharma definitely have decreased. There's like a ton of conspiracy theories on the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, Even though they are illogical, I can definitely see why people are spreading these conspiracy theories simply because we have lost trust in these companies. Like they place priority, like they place profits as their highest priority, and like we can no longer trust these companies because of that fact. There's also a big problem with patents, right? That's like some products like insulin, the founder of like the person that developed the current way of developing insulin that makes it so cheap, he sold the patent for like $1 because he wanted to see the world benefit off of his invention. But that's not the case for definitely a lot of the companies we see today, like AbbVie. How do you say it? But like they have this like they have this massive drug called the Humira, I think. Let me see. Yeah. And like it has a ton of uses and a lot of people are dependent on this drug. And it's one of AbbVie's biggest drugs. And they're about to lose their patent because time's up, right? And so I think what they're doing right now is basically marking up the price so they would limit their losses after the patent expires. But what is your guys' opinion on like patents and like the ethics around patents, especially for drugs, because we can see patents being used maliciously and at the expense of the users themselves.
Yeah, I mean, usually I think in a non like big pharma or like in a medical way, I think patents are like really important and like you protect your own work, especially if it's like an individual creator and he's and like they find out something and like that's theirs to own. I think that's really important. But when you put it in like the context of this, like obviously the same like mentality still applies. It doesn't just change because it's big pharma, but I think in terms of the ethics of it, it kind of does shift a little bit because now instead of a creator working really hard to get theirs, now you got like a big company who bought the patent or like who got it from somewhere else and now like or who bought the rights. But then now like using it in a sense that like exploits other people. And I think like if you do have a patent, that means that you are basically the one producing it and you kind of control what happens with it. In a sense, like you don't have much competition. And and I think that's like important because like or important to like consider because if you don't have that, that means that other companies can like create something similar and like just the way the system works is like if there's more competitors usually the price is going to go down and I think in that case like it does benefit a lot of people because if there's more people more producers they're going to like compete with each other and they're going to like obviously want to sell more so like the price just kind of naturally goes down but if you are like protected in a sense there like you still have to wait a while and like the case that Ivan just mentioned like they raise the price so like in the future they're not going to be like hit as hard, I guess, because they already made their money from before. But I think like they know that once their patent expires, or like once their time is up, they're not going to be making as much money because like competitors are going to come. But like even though they're not making that much money, it's good for like the individual person who needs it because they can get it at a lower price and like a much more affordable one.
I personally think that maybe like patents could be like I guess somewhat like distributed among like multiple companies, because like the ultimate goal for like the medications is like to like help people out, to save people's lives. But what we're seeing with big pharmaceuticals is that they're turning this goal that was like originated from the patents into just ways of making money, and in this way they're just like prioritizing money making over like saving people's lives. And and in my opinion, that's like extremely unethical.
Yeah, but a big problem definitely stems from lobbying, and like a ton of politicians in the government definitely have political benefits from vouching for these big pharmaceutical companies. So that's why they kind of have the balls to do these unethical things, because they have the government support. But another interesting thing is actually like how these problems are very specific to the US. Like in China actually, they are kind of dependent on, the import of drugs, and especially for all the other countries, a lot of other countries, because like big pharmaceutical companies that have found a drug, have the resources to research for different drugs for different diseases, are located actually in the US. So like the US kind of has a monopoly over the world's medicine. Um, and like in the US, we have problems definitely with business ethics, but in other countries, you have problems with shortages of drugs, and um, that's why the prices increase so much. So that leads to like copycat drugs, which are probably illegal if you bring them to the US, but in other international spheres, it's probably legal or like on the borderline. So, what are your guys' thoughts about like how we can go about solving this kind of problem? Like in the US, you have business ethics, but in the international, you have like also kind of business ethics, because these companies are trying to make the most money exporting these drugs.
I mean, like the ethics of bringing in these drugs from another country.
I don't know, like like companies in the US
Oh, okay.
exporting a limited amount because they're like, hey, we could earn the most money by exporting this X amount of drugs
Mm,
because we can.
like exporting them.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, okay, I think this is like a pretty complicated topic because like on one hand, they're ex they're like giving them, not giving them, they're selling them to other countries, right? And like obviously, depending on what that government does with it, like assuming that it goes to the people, which is a good thing because some countries like they just don't have it. Like in some cases it is a good thing, and like morally it does make sense. Like if someone is benefiting from it, like not the company, but like someone whose health benefits from it, that makes sense. um but I think at the same time there's like ethics on the other side of like the company only doing it to make profit, and they're only having that certain amount of like, okay, we're going to make profit off of this much, and like so we specifically have this much going out. And I think that's where it gets a little bit iffy, especially if like they're exporting it at like a really high price, and then that again becomes like a system of like, hey, what if you're in this other country and you're like really rich, so obviously you can afford it now, but if you're like poor, you still again can't afford it because A, it's limited, and B, it's probably going to be really expensive. So I think like yes, it's a good thing that some people do benefit, like some people's health do benefit, but at the same time there's a lot of like inequality that comes with, are you rich enough to actually afford it? But that's like, I think that applies like even if in the United States, right? Like someone mentioned like how some people have to like ration the amount that they use for insulin. But like if you could afford it with no problem, you're not going to usually do that. So I think like just the whole thing of equality and like how that affects the moral dilemmas for these companies is like a pretty big thing.
I think the problem is that like because these pharmaceutical companies they receive like I think they receive like government assistance like in terms of like funding for their research, and they get tax breaks from the US government. But even though they get this like help from the government, they're still charging these like almost absurd prices for the medication. And with so many people like suffering from like diabetes or other or with the like with different like health outbreaks and stuff like that, I feel like if they're getting this US government assistance, then they should be like charging a little bit less for like basic needs that like people like actually like it's a necessity, or otherwise people will die, you know.
Yeah, like definitely I can see why governments will want to fund these companies, but definitely there should be some kind of regulation on how ethics should play in these like large profit margins. So actually recently in I think it was Inflation Act that Biden recently passed, actually cited into law, was one of the biggest thing was limiting capping insulin at $35 per month for those on Medicare specifically, because that's under federal jurisdiction. But definitely that's a big step into a big step into the right direction. But what are you guys? How do you guys feel about how big of a role ethics should play in business? But also, like, what the government should do in order to make sure businesses are also helping humanity, but and not only helping themselves.
Oh, I think that's like a really big question. But I think like at the end of the day, like I understand that companies aren't there because they're like there for funsies, like they're there to make money. Like I understand that you have to let them make some money, right? But like I think if the cost of a product is like $5 and you're selling it for 150 or like 200 just because you can, that's where it gets to be a little bit of like, I don't think that's right. And also I think like because it's like so harshly marked up, I think there's also the point of like you're in the 21st century, you're not like thousands of years ago where like the whole point was just to simply survive. Like now in society there's like things of like, okay, we're living to like live and like have this culture and like do all of that, not just to simply live and like make money, right? Like so I think the ethics of that really do apply, but also like you can't, I mean in my opinion, you can't like expect companies to naturally on their own be like, no, we're just going to be really good, especially like these big pharma companies, like they're not nonprofit. So like you have to like make them like let them make some money in some sort of way, like whether that comes from the government or marking them up like their products up by like a teeny bit, not like 100 times over. Or like if that's not okay, I think the government should step in because at the end of the day, like as like a society, a collective society, you can't just like say, oh yeah, it's going to be so much more than what it takes to make us, and you guys can like have fun figuring out how your budget is going to work with that. Like I think that's just not okay. And like like I think the steps that Ivan mentioned about like how the government has been like having caps or like for Medicare and just having some steps towards that, I think that's a good thing. And like I also think that like you can't really solve this issue like in a day. I think it's going to be like a process of time. So, hopefully eventually at some point it's going to be a lot more fair and equitable.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like just like the ethics and like for especially for like pharmaceutical eyes, like I feel like the common goal is to like save people, you know? So I feel like the current system of like whatever is going on in pharmaceutical companies, that is like that is like not doing anything. It's I feel like it's detrimental to people who actually like need medication to like save their lives because like it sometimes it's just too expensive. But also I understand like the point of like those big pharmaceuticals need money so they can continue to like produce these medications for people that need to save money. But I feel like marking marking like the production costs up, marking the price up from the production costs by too much also like just is like it's like unfair to some people.
Yeah, adding on to Jack, actually, he brings up a good point that research definitely takes up a lot of money. So I think the government should subsidize, research even if it doesn't succeed, because it's research, right? There's not a guarantee that it would have a product. And also, like, this plays a role in these big pharma companies don't have like a good reason on having like a 2,500% markup. Um, and instead they are under, ethical and morality regulations on how their business model works, especially simply because they are working in a field where it's definitely saving the human population, right? You have like this inelastic demand for drugs. So definitely morality ethics plays a way bigger role in this sector as compared to like IT, like Google or Apple. Like you don't need an iPhone. You don't need quotation marks Google or the Google products, right? But when you're sick, or especially in the pandemic, you definitely need the vaccine. You definitely need, if you have diabetes, you definitely need insulin. So morality and ethics should definitely play a bigger role in the healthcare sector.
I think so too, because like I think also healthcare, because it's like such an essential thing. Like there's a lot of products out there that are like a little bit more on the luxury side, like you can live without that, or like you can do without it. But like for healthcare, I feel like that's just one of the very bare essentials that you need to have. Like for insulin, like you mentioned, like you can't, if you have diabetes, you can't just be like, I don't want it. It's a luxury. Like you kind of have to have it, or you have to get like some medical treatment of some kind. It's not like something you can just say you're gonna ignore. Like you can choose to go to like Costco and buy some food for fun, or like you can choose to go to like Louis Vuitton and buy a bag. But like for things like that, for like healthcare sector, it's people don't go to the doctor for fun. They're not going because they just want to. Like so, like obviously there has to be something there, and I think like the ethics of that is really important. So, but I think, but also like just ethics of business as a whole, and like the impact of it just like on society collectively is pretty big. Because if you think about like in our case here for like big pharma, um, like straying away from insulin, but like even going to like doctor's visits, or like going like anything like that, going to CVS or going to different pharmacies, like they charge you different prices. I don't know if that's like true for where you guys live, but like if from my doctor, if I go to CVS, if I go to somewhere else, like they're kind of different in prices. But like, I mean, obviously the stuff I get is like just like regular prescriptions. They're not like super expensive, but like 20. So like $21 versus $18 isn't that big of an effect on me and like my family. But I think like if there were like bigger pieces, that would be a lot more. So I think like as a whole, this like whole healthcare industry is probably needs to have some more reform, and the way like they treat their customers in society.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just gonna add like a simple point. I just feel like the current system is like very unfair for people. I said this like before, like and like I feel like there definitely needs to be some reform to this, to the big pharmaceutical, like the business cycle. And definitely we've already seen some governments like step in with the $35 cap for insulin Medicare, but we definitely want to see more of that in the future, for like for like for like pharmaceuticals to like also like reach the goal of like saving people's lives.
Exactly. I definitely agree with your points, Jack. But something else I probably took away from this is probably we don't really know a lot about how the research works. And simply because we prioritize capitalism, America raw capitalism. Like we kind of like prioritize those things, and it has negative effects. Nothing's a perfect system because we have this competitive environment and like patents and stuff. These pharmaceutical companies will either make or break because they have a drug that is very popular, works, help save people's lives, is because of that fact. Because we're in a capitalist economy, those pharmaceutical companies either break or bust, right? And I think that that's one of the contributing factors on why it's not that easy to subsidize research at that point, because you're subsidizing private companies who are trying to make a profit at the expense of their users, which is kind of you know that doesn't align with a lot of other companies, but definitely the case in the healthcare sector. So it's a very complicated solution to a big problem we have in today's world. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, oh, yeah, what were you gonna say?
no, you can say.
I mean, yeah, I think like my takeaway is just like this entire not entire industry, but I think many parts of the industry needs to have like reform, and just considering like the ethics of it, because like I think on the one hand, one of my takeaways is thinking like you can't expect these companies to like completely do everything for free and like break even. Like I think that's not realistic within the next couple hundred of years, or maybe like a century, but I don't think that's realistic. But I think what does need to happen is that like they do need to lower their prices, and maybe not to like the exact price of production, but like somewhere much closer than what some of the medicines currently are. And I think like if like things continue as what they currently are, it's a lot more about like equality, and just like how some people are like a lot more affected by the prices than other people are. And I think that's just another one of the more systemic inequality, like pieces of inequality in our society that should be changed.
And Kaiwen, do
Yeah,
you have anything?
yeah, I definitely agree. I did think yeah, a couple of takeaways I had, because I think that like, especially because so many like Americans are like, I think our tax money is going into funding like this creation of like of new drugs and for these big pharma companies. So like I definitely agree with Jackie in that like the prices that we're paying for these products, these drugs that come out, shouldn't be like as high as they are now. I think big pharma is just like they're they're focused a lot on making profit. They're trying to maximize their profit, and that's kind of hurting people at the end of the day who've already whose taxpayer money already goes into this with the government subsidies and all that already helping these big pharma companies. So yeah, I think that that's like one of the major problems right now. This is a quick takeaway.
Yeah. So thank you guys for tuning in into today's episode on the ethics of business, especially in the healthcare sector. And uh and we'll come back next week. And thank you guys obviously for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.